Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 32nd episode of The Greats of History, the podcast where we get to know people with the epithet of the Great and try to get past the honorific and understand who they were, what they did, and why some people seem to like them so much. I'm grateful that you're here. Last time, we tracked the rise of Caesar to a status equal to that of Pompey, at least in the hearts and minds of his countrymen. We then dove into Caesar's famous crossing of the Rubicon and the start of the civil war that pitted Caesar as the representative of the people on one side and Pompey fighting for the conservatives of the republic and senatorial prerogatives on the other. Pompey left for Greece to regroup and plan his campaign, leaving Italy fully in Caesar's hands. Defeating Caesar would be the capstone in a career of unsurpassed glory and accomplishment. As for Caesar, with Pompey sailing for the east, all of Italy, as mentioned, was now in his hands, a task he accomplished in a preposterously short 60 days. For his part, Caesar didn't have a navy to chase his rival, but that didn't mean he stayed still. There was a lot to do. Given that the Pompeian forces were spread out across the Roman world, his plan was multifaceted. He sent a subordinate to lead 6 legions in Hispania. Their goal was to confront the senatorial legions there in order to prevent them from linking up with Pompey. Fighting this force, while it was manageable, prevented them from making Pompey invincible. Meanwhile, in Rome, Caesar was confronted with the awkward fact that most of the senators, especially the noble leaders of that ancient body, had gone with Pompey as he embarked for the east. What was left was a rump of its former self. Anxious to be sure to cloak his actions in the veneer of legitimacy, Caesar took a moment in Rome to build a new replacement Senate. He cobbled together this assemblage by recalling retirees, promoting equestrians, provincials, even his own officers. Their mandate was to give Caesar's action a rubber stamp. With this quote-unquote Senate set up, Caesar rushed to Hispania to meet up with his troops. After a few initial setbacks, Caesar surrounded and captured 5 Pompeian legions. 2 of these he marched back to their home province in Gaul and discharged. The other 3 were native to Hispania. He discharged them then and there. He therefore let all the men leave the service and let all their officers and generals walk away, unfettered, bound only by a promise not to re-enter the fight. Several of these went back on their word, raised some additional troops from the discharged veterans, arranged transportations, and shipped themselves to Greece to fight for Pompey. For Caesar's part, his reputation for clemency spread, though at the cost of having to beat the same troops twice. But this isn't so much about Caesar as it is Pompey, and over in Greece, Pompey's strategy seemed to be paying dividends. The force that he put together was truly massive. Calling on his tremendous depth of resources, Pompey assembled a navy more than 500 ships strong, 7,000 cavalry, and approximately 50,000 heavy infantry. For his part, camp life was good to Pompey. Now free of the luxury of Rome, the great general donned his armor and exercised with his troops, working himself back into a fighting trim. He rode his horses, threw javelins, and ate with the troops in a common mess. He was back in the field, surrounded by the people that loved him, that were awed by him and his towering reputation. He didn't have to play politics anymore. The lines had been drawn. The picture was clear. Pompey was in his element. And Pompey's reputation pulled more and more people to his side. From all over the Roman world, prominent people flocked to Pompey. He was joined by leading senators like Cicero, defectors from Caesar like Labienus, kings and ambassadors from client kingdoms, even Marcus Junius Brutus. Yup, that Brutus, who joined Pompey because of his belief in the cause, and despite the fact that Pompey had once executed Brutus's own father. At age 57, Pompey was at the peak of his powers, commanding a huge army with kings and senators alike at his side, at his rightful place, at the top of the Roman world. With each day, Pompey was getting stronger, politically, militarily, and even, with his daily exercise regimen, physically. Caesar was already the underdog. Delay just made the gap between the two bigger and bigger. He needed to get to Greece to confront his rival as quickly as possible, and the fastest way to do so was to follow Pompey across the Adriatic Sea. But his lack of ships and crews represented a considerable challenge. He did his best, but Caesar's attempt to build a navy were stymied by the Optimate forces. He also faced mutinies from several of his legions. By sheer force of will, stirring rhetoric, and piles of promises, Caesar managed to quell the rebellions, get a navy cobbled together, and his army transported across the Adriatic. He did this despite the best efforts of his old nemesis Bibulus, that old consular colleague and lifelong adversary. Bibulus had been in charge of Pompey's fleet, tasked with preventing Caesar's crossing. Obsessed with stopping Caesar, Bibulus drove himself and his crews relentlessly. He worked himself to death, literally, in the winter of 48 BCE, having failed to stop Caesar from crossing the Adriatic. Caesar landed in Greece with half of his total forces and trusted a lieutenant to follow quickly with the rest. By the time Caesar made his way to Greece, Pompey rightfully felt secure in his position, drastically outnumbering Caesar. He took great comfort in the sheer numbers. However, many of Pompey's troops were still new recruits, where Caesar's 7 legions were battle-hardened veterans. For his part, Caesar was struggling to bring his full army together. With the difficult winter sailing conditions, his deputy, Mark Antony, was struggling to get the remaining 4 Caesarian legions across the Adriatic. When Caesar made landfall, he further split his force, sending 2 legions to the east to prevent Pompey from receiving further reinforcements. He then promptly took his remaining 5 north, aiming directly for the city of Dyrrhachium, a critical logistics hub. He wanted to seize the city to cut Pompey off from his supply chain, but Pompey beat Caesar there, occupying the city and the high ground that surrounded it. Pompey set up a camp on a hill called Petra, which means rock. Caesar offered battle, but because his troops were still green, Pompey declined. Pompey's ultimate plan was to build and train his army, then sail for and take back Italy. Denied the chance for open battle, Caesar then picked his own hill and set up a camp a bit inland. Pompey had the better position. He was up against the coast, so Caesar couldn't get behind him. Plus, this gave Pompey access to a harbor, so he could be resupplied by sea. Since he couldn't lure Pompey out to fight, Caesar decided to trap him in. With astonishing speed, and bolstered by Antony's troops, who arrived in March, Caesar's men dug trenches, put up fortifications, and built a long wall to pin the Pompeians in. In short order, they built a wall nearly 14 miles long, punctuated by 24 forts. Not to be outdone, Pompey built his own fortifications, and the 2 walls snaked in parallel towards the south. From time to time, the Pompeian and Caesarian troops engaged in skirmishing. At one point, a major battle erupted between the armies, and that resulted in a resounding victory for Pompey. It left Caesar's 9th Legion battered. As the siege wore on, food ran short in Caesar's camp. But he had dammed the streams that took fresh water to Pompey's camp. Water began to run short, and disease took hold. By early July 48 BCE, Caesar's fortifications neared their completion and threatened to completely engulf Pompey. Pompey responded by attacking a weak point in Caesar's line. Caesar pushed back the assault with great difficulty, but Pompey secured the end of the uncompleted line and prevented Caesar from finishing the siege works. After their victory, Pompey's troops occupied a fort that Caesar's troops had previously abandoned as undefensible. Pompey understood that time was on his side, but the people around him, with much less experience in the ways of camp life and warfare, began to get quite smug about how things were developing. Seeking to reclaim the advantage and his troops near starving, on the 10th of July, Caesar ordered a nighttime attack on Pompey's camp. Pompey's troops, having gained a measure of training and experience, pushed back and gained the advantage, killing 1,000 of Caesar's men. Content to break out of the siege, Pompey used the chance to march his troops to a better situation and let Caesar retreat unmolested. Caesar considered this a huge blunder by Pompey. After a siege of months, Pompey had Caesar on the ropes, and instead of following up his initial successes, he simply let Caesar pull back and live to fight another day. In addressing his men, Caesar told them that, according to the historian Plutarch, quote, "Today victory would have been with the enemy if they had had a victor in command," close quote. Pompey, at least according to Caesar, had lost his killer instinct. But Labienus, the general that had defected to Pompey from Caesar at the outset of the Civil War, sure didn't, as he dragged Caesar's captured soldiers out and had them executed in sight of Caesar's army. Caesar's critique of Pompey might have been a little unkind. Pompey had entered the siege with a green army, had managed to hold off Caesar long enough to get some much-needed training, and had some initial successes in fighting. And despite being thirsty for lack of water, he marched his army to a favorable turf, more or less intact. Caesar had failed to draw Pompey into battle, while he had the advantage in experience, and he remained cut off from Italy, outnumbered 2-1. Pompey was buoyed by the success at Dyrrhachium. He had been patient, so much so that the senators and camp followers had grown frustrated with his inaction, but he held firm, and he was stronger for it. He began to get the sense that he might not need to move the theater of operations back to Italy. Winning the war in Greece would spare Italy the chaos of more civil war. Besides, Pompey didn't want to be seen running away from Caesar a second time. He would maneuver the war for victory in Greece, and he was getting reinforcements. His father in law, Metellus Scipio, arrived from Syria with fresh troops, which he used to attack one of Caesar's subordinates. Caesar moved his full force to the north to come to the aid of his general. Suddenly, rather than skirmishing with a detachment of Caesar's troops, Metellus Scipio was facing the entire Caesarian force, dramatically outnumbered and facing the very real prospect of total destruction. To prevent his father-in-law from getting obliterated, Pompey followed fast to link up with his father-in-law and the troops under his command. Near Pharsalus, the two armies camped across a vast plain from one another. Inside the Pompeian camp, the commander was surrounded on all sides by senators anxious for the war to be won here and now. Hundreds of the cream of the crop of Rome's oligarchy called for action. Morale was high. The troops had gotten the better of Caesar, and there were twice as many of them. They urged Pompey to offer battle and put an end to this war and an end to Caesar. For his part, Pompey urged caution. Caesar's troops were not so easily dismissed. He had the core of his Gallic legions. Pompey had the advantages: supplies, communications, the ability to gather reinforcements. He calmly explained to the senators that the better strategy is to force Caesar to stay in the field as long as possible and wear him down. Sap the strength of Caesar's core, his Gallic legions. Wear him out, tire him out, drain them. Delay favored Pompey. But day after day, the cocky senators just urged action. Even Labienus, the defector from Caesar, urged Pompey to act. Reluctantly, and worn down by their relentless carping, Pompey switched off the inner voice that had been urging him to be cautious, gave in, and somewhat reluctantly ordered his soldiers to prepare for battle. On August 9th, the two sides lined up. Caesar was delighted. He exhorted his men, saying that they had the chance to secure victory and their own glory. He sent word that any citizens captured in battle would be pardoned, and that Pompey should be captured alive. Caesar was confident. He took to the field with 21,000 troops and 1,000 cavalry. Despite being brought to the field reluctantly, Pompey did bring an enormous advantage to the looming battle. The senatorial forces that he commanded had 40,000 troops, give or take, another 4,000 allied auxiliaries, and 7,000 cavalry, a 2-to-1 troop advantage and a staggering 7-to-1 cavalry advantage. While many of these troops were newish recruits, a substantial more were veterans, including the 15th Legion, one of the units that had passed back and forth between Pompey and Caesar. Plus, Pompey's troops were now well fed, well provisioned, and in their battles with Caesar had more than held their own. Back in camp, the jubilant senators predicted total victory. They began discussing the post-war settlements, assigning themselves various magistracies and governorships, and generally letting themselves get excited about the prospect for total victory. It's hard to blame them. Their side was the stronger one on paper, and they had Pompey the Great leading their forces. Everything he had done in his life and his career had pointed toward this battle as being another in his spectacular career. There were a few absolute titans in Roman history: Romulus, Camillus, Marius. Win this one, and there would be little doubt that Pompey would elevate himself into the absolute pantheon, the cream of the crop. He'd rise to the top, or better yet, a Terminator, like Arnold Schwarzenegger. But for all this bluster, Pompey himself was more pragmatic. He had a battle to fight, and it wasn't all roses. For example, the questionable level of battlefield experiences of many of his troops still nagged at him. But if this relative lack of experience of the infantry left a few question marks in Pompey's head, his advantage in cavalry, commanded by Labienus, was absolute and a huge boost to his confidence. Plus, Labienus had fought beside Caesar for years across his Gallic campaigns and right up to the crossing of the Rubicon. Pompey thus had in his inner circle one general who understood how Caesar thought, how he approached battle, etc. Buoyed by this coup of intel, Pompey weighed up Caesar's line and determined that Caesar's right was his weakest point, and he decided to mount a massive cavalry charge at this vulnerability. If he could break through or run off Caesar's cavalry, Then Pompey could use his superior numbers to turn on Caesar's infantry and, coordinated with his heavy infantry, rout Caesar, end the civil war, and achieve all the lofty goals of the senators goading him to act. Clearly aware of his own weakness, Caesar intuited the strategy, and his suspicions were confirmed as he saw Pompey draw up his battle lines. Caesar put his cavalry on the right, across from Pompey's. At first, this seemed to play right into Pompey's hands, matching Caesar's weakness to Pompey's strength. But Caesar peeled away several thousand reserve troops and hid them behind his lines. Anticipating that his cavalry would be driven back, Caesar ordered them to charge and meet Labienus to draw them into the fight. The superior numbers of the Pompeian cavalry indeed drove back Caesar's. Unaware that Caesar had planned to send his cavalry into a fight from which they would have to quickly retreat, and surging with confidence, Labienus and the Pompeian cavalry gave chase. They fell right into a waiting trap. Caesar's hidden reserves, specially deployed to attack cavalry, sprung from their hiding places and thrust javelins into the faces and horses of Labienus's troops, who were scattered, panicked, and fled. Labienus tried to regroup, but the terror-stricken cavalry left the battlefield. At a stroke, Pompey's biggest advantage had evaporated, but he still had a 2-to-1 troop advantage, and if he kept a level head, he could put this to great effect. Unfortunately for Pompey, from the catastrophe with the cavalry, things went from bad to worse, as the foot soldiers squared off against one another. The fighting was intense, the battle at first hard fought, but the advantage in numbers could not overcome the deadly experience of Caesar's loyal legions. They had conquered in Gaul, in Britain, in Hispania. Now, fighting Romans instead of barbarians, the result was the same, a smashing victory and a demoralized enemy. Caesar had won the day in large part by luring a cocky adversary into a trap, feigning retreat to lure soldiers into a waiting ambush. Fully aware of this, and choosing not to pursue the fleeing Pompeians, some of Caesar's commanders broke off the engagement and returned to camp so as to avoid being drawn into a trap of their own. As a result, nearly 20,000 of the senatorial army fled the coast, boarded ships, and sailed for North Africa to regroup. Pompey was dazed by the total and sudden collapse of his army. He had held all the advantages, right up until he didn't. He had to be dragged from the field for his safety, and sitting in his tent, he was shell-shocked. It was only a matter of time before Caesar would break into his camp. One of Pompey's dedicated officers grabbed the general, put him on a horse with a small group of companions, and fled east. He eventually boarded a grain ship and sailed for the island of Lesbos, where his wife and his son Sextus had been waiting out the war, eager for word of the great hero's forthcoming victory. With family in hand, Pompey considered his next move. Sure, he'd been bested by Caesar, but he'd been lulled into a battle against his better judgment. With time, he could gather up the remnants of a senatorial army, make sure they fought the war his way, and gain the upper hand. He still had a whole host of client kings in the east that would heed his call for troops, materiel, cash. They owed him their thrones. He would call in these debts and rebuild. Besides, Roman civil wars dragged on. Armies switched sides all the time. Legions could be assembled, trained, readied for war. Fortunes waxed and waned. This was not a total loss, and the resources of North Africa were deep and profound. This was a phase. Pompey just needed time to rebuild his shattered army and confidence. As mentioned, one asset that Pompey could draw on was his supply of client kings that owed their thrones to him. One of these was the young Egyptian pharaoh, Ptolemy XIII, and his sister wife, Cleopatra VII. Pompey had protected their throne and that of their father, the late Ptolemy XII. Like many of his clients, they owed him, and Pompey set sail for Alexandria to call his debts. Egypt was wealthy beyond description. From grain to gold, the kingdom overflowed with resources, and the Ptolemies had an army. Egypt could solve a lot of Pompey's problems and could be a platform for his comeback tour. Caesar got wind that Pompey was headed to Egypt. He gathered a ragtag group, including some of Pompey's troops that he had captured, pardoned, and won over to his cause, and set out for Egypt, fast on Pompey's heels. By the time Pompey arrived in Egypt, the two co-pharaohs had fallen into dispute, and the younger Ptolemy XIII had driven off his older sister wife Cleopatra, who was in hiding. Pompey was greeted offshore in a boat led by Ptolemy's leading general, Achillas. He, in turn, had two officers by his side, both, ironically, Roman mercenaries. These Romans were serving the Ptolemies, but previously had served under Pompey. Thus, they were sent by their current patron to welcome and invite back to shore their former commander. The small greeting party invited Pompey and 2 of his bodyguards to board their boat and head to shore. Achillas would then accompany Pompey to meet with the young pharaoh, Ptolemy XIII. Cornelia, his wife, sensed danger, and she implored her husband not to go. He waved off these concerns and climbed aboard. The Ptolemies had depended on the Romans for protection for a long time. If he was ill at ease going to shore with Achillas, Pompey showed no such indications. The group rowed to shore in silence. Just as the boat made landfall, Achillas and his 2 companion officers pulled out daggers from the folds of their cloaks and butchered Pompey and his 2 bodyguards. Cornelia and Sextus screamed in horror as they watched the murder of their husband and father, his blood soaking into the Egyptian sand. As he lay dying, Pompey the Great's last earthly act was to pull his cloak over his head so that his family didn't see his death throes. He died on the shore just outside Alexandria, the city founded by his hero Alexander 300 years earlier. He was 57 years old, still in fighting shape, with many battles left to fight. It was an ignominious end to his life and career. Caesar arrived 4 days later. Ptolemy presented Pompey's severed head to Caesar. The young king and his advisors had calculated that Caesar was destined to win the civil war. They figured they could curry favor with Caesar by eliminating his rival. What's more, by aiding Caesar through the elimination of his rival, they could switch their allegiance to Caesar, count on his patronage, and continue to operate their kingdom with a minimum of Roman interference, as had been the arrangement for some time. It made sense, but then again, Caesar was never so easily predicted. He was far from delighted and expressed his shock and horror. It was one thing for a Roman to fight another, but another thing entirely for a foreign ruler to murder a Roman, and one of Pompey's status, a 3-time consul who had triumphed 3 times. Caesar expressed deep mourning. All he wanted was the chance to sit down with his old ally and talk things through and once again settle affairs between them. Of course, it's easy to express magnanimity when your adversary is dead. Who knows how sincere Caesar's expressions of mourning truly were? He did forward Pompey's remains to his widow so that the great man of Rome could receive a proper burial, one befitting all the honors and accolades that he so richly deserved. Now, at this point, it would be very easy to follow the arc of Caesar, as he definitely did not play into the strategy devised by Ptolemy and his scheming advisors. Caesar entered the civil war on the side of the rebel Cleopatra, and the outcome of that conflict was that the young king died, his advisors were eliminated, and the way to rule cleared for the legendary queen. This is a dramatic oversimplification, but since Pompey's story died at Alexandria, and he is our subject here, we will have to content ourselves knowing that there are many fun stories left to tell on this topic, but for another time and place. If it's any consolation, Caesar's adventures in Alexandria offer us the crossover storyline as it directly involves the family and rise to power of our next the Great, Herod. For their part, the Optimates would continue to fight. Caesar continued to mount campaigns and won a series of decisive victories. Caesar won all the battles that mattered. Metellus Scipio and Cato the Younger both committed suicide in North Africa to avoid falling into Caesar's hands. Metellus Scipio fell on his sword, inflicting on himself a mortal wound. As he waited to die, he stoically told his surrounding troops, quote, "Your general's just fine," close quote. His death would be lauded as a great example of Roman manliness and virtue. Cato likewise tried to die by his own hand. At first, his attempts were thwarted by his loyal followers who rushed in, tended to his wounds, and stitched him back together. Later the same evening, he pulled out his stitches and his own intestines and bled to death. As with Metellus Scipio, Cato would be lauded for the indifference with which he approached death. These two, and many more besides, might have died with what their contemporaries considered to be so much dignity, but they also did so much to kill the Republic and inadvertently created the power vacuum that led to Rome's dramatic transition from one-man rule, a period we now call the Empire. For his part, Caesar forgave his enemies, feeling that he gained more by pardons than by executions. Some of his adversaries, including Pompey's son Sextus, the one who watched his father's death, would continue fighting even past Caesar's own assassination in 44 BCE. Sextus, in fact, would fight all the way into the next civil war, which pitted the successors of Caesar in a fight for ultimate control of the Roman world. The victor of those wars was Gaius Octavius, the great-nephew of Caesar, most commonly known to us today as Augustus, widely considered to be the first emperor of Rome. Even in death, Caesar prevailed. So, what do we make of Pompey, the first in this series to be called the Great in their own lifetime? He isn't entirely easy to assess. Many of the greats that came before him had a clear goal or ideology. Sargon was driven to build a multi ethnic kingdom, what we now call the world's first empire. Mithridates was driven to build in Anatolia, the Black Sea version of what Rome built around the Mediterranean. Looking back on these and other careers, there seems to have been a bit of a unifying theory to their lives. Pompey, on the other hand, is a bit trickier. He can be a hard guy to nail down because both politically and militarily, he fought for conservative and populist causes alike. He rose to power fighting for an arch conservative. He cemented his position with allegiance to populists like Crassus and Caesar. He ended his career fighting, again, for the conservatives. Did his ideology change over the course of his life? Or did he follow the opportunity for personal glory wherever it might lead? It's hard to tell. You get the feeling that, at the end of the day, he wanted or needed to be liked or even loved. The desire to drape himself in laurels led him down a very twisted path. He seemed to be very loyal to Sulla, but once Pompey became the indispensable man of Rome, he had a hard time envisioning himself as anything but the very center of the circle. It seems that the organizing principle of his career was to make himself the leading man, ahead above everyone else in status, prestige, and legacy. This isn't a demerit against him, rather, this was the same game that most of the nobility played. And to be fair and clear, it's not like political factions were crystallized and rigid in the way that they are today. People were much more fluid in their outlooks. In his quest for accolades, Pompey was placing himself directly in line with the social values of his day. The only reason Pompey's political and ideological fluidity stand out is because he was so successful at playing the game. Much of his accomplishments were successes that built on the works of others. Two prime examples are his mop-up battle against the shattered remnants of the Spartacus army and the final campaign against Mithridates. In both cases, Pompey was the enormous beneficiary of the grueling work and campaigns of other Roman commanders. The ease with which Pompey swatted aside the shattered remnants of Spartacus could never have happened without the stark brutality of Crassus towards the enemy and his own troops. In the Mithridatic War, it was Lucullus who campaigned year after year, slowly sapping the great Pontic king's political and militaristic strength. Mithridates had plenty of fight left in him by the time Pompey showed up on the scene, but Pompey had a huge head start winning the campaign as compared with the status of Lucullus faced when he got the whole project up and running in the first place. But should this make us think less of his accomplishments? Maybe stealing Crassus's thunder had been a bit grandiose, and more credit should have gone to Pompey's great rival. But that was just one campaign among a lifetime of campaigns. As for the Mithridatic Wars, Mithridates had been at war with Rome off and on for decades. It only looks like Lucullus had the whole thing wrapped up because Pompey was ultimately able to bring the campaign to a successful conclusion. At the time he assumed command, the kingdoms from Anatolia to Mesopotamia were a jumbled mess. Not only did Pompey finally remove the threat of Mithridates from Rome permanently, but he also stepped into dozens of exceedingly complex geopolitical situations, calmed everything down, and won for Rome new territories and new allies. Pompey's eastern settlement showed a shrewd political sense, and it set Rome up for success in the region for 1,500 years. Yes, you heard that right. For while the Western Roman Empire would collapse in 476 CE, the Eastern Empire, what we today call the Byzantine Empire, lived until 1453 CE, a millennium and a half after Pompey reorganized the region. His political work was important and enduring. Don't get me wrong, it's not like the eastern half of the Roman world ran smoothly in a straight line from Pompey to the final collapse of Constantinople, the event that signaled the true end of the Roman Empire. But it's hard to see this process developing to Rome's advantage without the groundwork of Pompey. There is a reason that Rome as a political entity lasted so long, and a big part of that reason was the work and vision of Pompey Magnus. I don't want to overstate this. I don't think Pompey was a brilliant geopolitical strategist, nor do I think he envisioned the Roman world evolving into anything other than what he knew it to be. He didn't anticipate the Byzantine Empire, but he helped make it possible, and a part of the obscenely long chronology of Roman history owes its roots to Pompey's ability to settle the chaos of the Eastern kingdoms. In his career, Pompey definitely had some moments of big ego, but even until the end, he kept a level head and made pragmatic, solid decisions. At the vital hour, with everything on the line, he simply let himself get worn down by less shrewd strategists and he was unfortunate to be matched up against Caesar, one of the most relentlessly ambitious people in all of human history. These added up to a disaster that even the great Pompey couldn't overcome. Ironically, perhaps, in his last campaign, Pompey was fighting on behalf of a cause that was already dead, the Roman Republic. Even if he had won at Pharsalus, and the Optimates had re-entered Italy in triumph, and smugly reinstalled themselves at the top of the oligarchy, the foundation of the Republic was too rotten to support the traditional privileges they were so adamant about claiming. It was bound to collapse. Caesar was an accelerant, not the cause. The Roman world was too big, too diverse, for the control of the apparatus of the state to be limited to a few hundred rich old men. That's not to say that the rise of the emperors, and with it, the authority in the hands of a singular person, was inevitable. But the Republic had been in desperate need of reform for over a century, and all attempts to do so were met with violence and anarchy. Solving these problems was bigger than any one person. Pompey can't be blamed for failing as the final hope for the salvation of the Republic. Weirdly, it's hard to tell the story of Pompey without it getting hijacked by Caesar. Caesar, it seems, is the only Roman of the age that could outshine Pompey, and yet he did. Caesar is such a big character that often, the first time people encounter Pompey within history, it's as a member of the first triumvirate. Interested people dive into the life and career of Caesar, and along the way, they happen to meet Pompey. Encountering Pompey only in context of what he meant for the ascendant Caesar lops off a huge chunk of the accomplishments of Pompey. By the time that Pompey, Crassus, and Caesar formed the first triumvirate, Pompey had already amassed a resume that would have marked him out as one of the most accomplished individuals in all of Roman history, including ending the Sertorian War, crushing the Cilician pirates, winning the consulship, celebrating multiple triumphs, winning the Mithridatic War, reorganizing the East. He just lost to Caesar in one battle and was betrayed by a client king in far-off Egypt. In a way, though, he got the last laugh. On the Ides of March 44 BCE, a conspiracy of several leading senators, including Brutus and Cassius, famously assassinated Julius Caesar. Their motive was to end what they saw as his tyranny and to restore the rights of the Senate. They killed Caesar to save the Republic, or so they claimed. The death of Caesar shocked the world, and it is rightly considered to be one of the most dramatic events in history, but often overlooked is just where it happened. Pompey gave Rome its first permanent theater. The magnificent theater of Pompey was more than a theater. It contained all sorts of amenities and facilities. At the far end of the complex was the Curia, a senate house. The Senate moved around from place to place, holding its meetings in temples, public buildings, and occasionally the theater of Pompey. It was this place at which the Senate convened on the Ides of March, and where the conspirators murdered Julius Caesar. It all happened under the unmoving gaze of a statue of none other than Pompey the Great. Caesar died at his feet, pulling his cloak over his head as he lay dying, just as his former colleague had done on the shores of Alexandria just 4 years before. Former rivals, former relatives, former colleagues, reunited in death. You can't tell the story of one without the other. Pompey was called the Great long before Caesar entered his life. Caesar was only considered to be great because he was able to draft off the glory of Pompey to accelerate his public life. It's entirely up to you to decide which one was truly greater, but there's no arguing that on balance, Pompey ranks among the greats. It's been a long road, and to be honest, I'm gonna miss the guy. I hope you enjoyed these episodes about Pompey. Join me on the next one, when we will dive into the dramatic and controversial life of one of history's great villains. The question we will ask is how much of this reputation is true and how much is just so much propaganda? So join us as we explore the brilliant life and violent times of Herod the Great.